First of all, thank you so much to Christina and to Katarzyna for the invitation, for the honor of being here in this wonderful space. For contextual purposes, it might be useful to say we have all just come from an event in Katowice where we have been talking quite a bit about devising. And as a result of that, I have decided to narrow down my presentation this morning to something a bit more specific. So the abstract that you might be seeing in the proceedings for this event is kind of to be understood as a broad umbrella under which the presentation this morning sits. So the main thing to say maybe is, what do I mean by this post-Gutenberg era? It's something that that kind of goes through all of my work so far. That's why I've kind of put all these references to my other works to remind me how my work really began with an interest in ensemble and what I call theatre making, which is a way of thinking about, this book Theatre Making was a way of thinking about how contemporary theatre and performance are being made. But I wanted to overcome the binary between text-based theatre and sort of performance paradigms. And I wanted to understand ways in which contemporary theatre and performance are working across this divide in creating new ways of working. And as I kind of progressed my research into these other areas, such as theatre criticism and the dramaturgies of speech and sound, I began to contextualize my work. But theatre criticism book was really mostly concerned with the blogosphere and the arrival of new ways of thinking and writing about performance that are digitally based, so no longer existing within the regimes of the printed word, and what that meant for both how we think about performance and how we make performance. And my more recent work, which culminated in this website, represented by the logo in the upper right-hand corner, auralia.space, being an investigation in the dramaturgies of speech and sound. It kind of features a lot of something like some 80 recordings of conversations, presentations, interviews with artists working under the remit of oral and aural dramaturgies, and also scholars writing about this way of working. But what I want to speak about specifically today is this notion of directing in the contexts of theatre making that do not begin with the written word. And this is linked to, as I was saying earlier, it is linked to some of what emerged over the last few days in Katowice, as we've been talking about. What does it mean to work in an ensemble? What implications does this have in terms of leadership? And how can we think of making work in this way, specifically in relation to what the director's role is in this? And in about the year 2020, I published this article. In fact, I was commissioned to write this article for the new edition of the book Director's Theatre, which was originally published in 1988. It was a book written by David Bradby and David Williams called Director's Theatre. And this book had kind of chapters about these key directors of the 20th century. where Bradby and Williams were sort of trying to treat these as case studies that were significant at this moment in time. And then in sort of around the year 2015, Peter Burnish decided to do a new edition of this book with 4 more essays added to the original text. And he commissioned these essays from a number of scholars, including myself. He asked me specifically to write about the director in the ensemble, which, because of my pre-existing publications on ensemble theatre. And at that point in time, I was returning from maternity leave, and I was looking for the best possible, the most relevant way to address this question. And at that same moment, I became aware of a new piece of theatre being created at the National Theatre in London. And it's, sorry, I'm just going to quickly go to that example. This is, it was a piece called Lost Without Words, which was the first fully improvised show at the National Theatre. So, the show, when I say fully improvised, it meant it was being improvised every night of the performance from scratch. So in the Chicago vein of improvisation and improvised theatre. But what was interesting about these particular actors in this show was that they were all aged 70 and above. They had all worked with these 2 directors, Phelim McDermott and Lee Simpson, previously. Phelim McDermott and Lee Simpson ran a company called Improbable, and they gathered these actors together with the purpose of enabling them to perform without having to learn lines from a script, because most of them had stopped performing as a result of this challenge that comes with old age. And another interesting circumstance was that none of them had trained in improvisation when they trained as actors, because they all trained in the time when text was very much valued. Learning to perform in text-based theatre was the most important thing, and actually there was even some snobbery in the circles that these actors moved in, snobbery coming from their colleagues about improvisation as being the lower form. Nonetheless, these actors were all very enthusiastic about learning this new skill, and they were placed in a situation where their rehearsals, which I attended with a view to actually writing this article, the rehearsals were mostly about learning the skills of improvisation and working within a particular methodology that Lee and Phelim had developed as part of their company Improbable. So what I want to do today is, with this presentation, is to offer a very brief overview of some ideas around directorial authorship in this period from 1988 to today, so to properly contextualize this case study of Lost Without Words and what was happening in the rehearsal room here. So this paper also revisits and considers the significance of improvisation as an organizing system rather than an auxiliary rehearsal technique. So improvisation is not being treated here as something that helps in the process, but something that offers kind of systemic organizational principles. It is an exploration of this particular case study, but it is also an exploration of how we might reconceive of leadership as an eco-based activity rather than ego-based activity. So challenging this notion that leadership and authority belongs to a single person. And it proposes a model of sort of hierarchical director, as I call it, for the 21st century. Because of the amount of information in this paper, I will try and whiz through it, but really what I'm proposing also is that this material functions as a hierarchy in itself. I will explain what hierarchy, what I mean by hierarchy later, drawing from existing definitions. But this is an example of it for Thomas Saraceno's piece that was on in the 2009 Venice Biennale, has been described as a hierarchical structure. And Bruno Latour has written about it as well, as being a kind of, and in fact the way he characterizes it is as a representation of the way in which the structure exists as a network of spheres. So what we are seeing in it is spheres being connected into a network. And each sphere represents sort of its own, each sphere kind of represents its own hierarchy, which are nonetheless connected and interconnected into this overall structure that represents a hierarchy. I will come back into this in a bit more depth as we go. But I want to now go back into context. So very quickly, actually, I won't go into all of this in great detail, but Bradwin Williams, in their book Directors Theatre, offer a number of potential designations of what it is that the director does. And it ranges from being from doing scenic writing. They're still very much operating within this idea of authorship that is writing based, to being a guru and a leader of the ensemble. They're dealing with directors, as you've seen from that list that I showed at the beginning, who very often took on a very clear leadership role in their ensembles, and very often took on the task of training their ensembles in a particular way of working. However, a more recent book about directing by Simon Shepherd, which I find very interesting. Shepherd wrote this book in 2012, and in it, amongst other things, he also writes about how in the British context there is a palpable absence of directorial training for reasons that are not fully known yet. But when you compare the British context to some of the other European contexts, and indeed the American context, there is far less training for the directors in Britain than there is elsewhere. Nonetheless, we do have very significant directors coming out of the British context. And Shepherd, in his book, first of all notes that by 1989, directing became a dirty word. And by this he means it was a lot of people were trying to get away from being the director in this conventional sense of a guru, because they felt that to be overly an overly authoritarian way of working. And so Shepherd, in his book, identifies a new set of designations for what it is that a director does. So, for example, he offers the notion of facilitator, which he ascribes to people like Robert Lepage, or conductor, creative producer, agent in dispersed directing, such as in the examples of collectives like Shunt, or custodian of an atmosphere, or an agent in parallel directing, again, characteristic of an ensemble such as Punch Drunk that doesn't have a single director. It has two people at the helm, one a choreographer and one a kind of more of a director who organizes the work, the structure of the work as a whole. I became interested in what it is that Shepard means by facilitation specifically, and because this is also relevant to the case study I want to profile today. And Shepard talks about facilitation as being means of establishing a framework within which the actors will engage with the material and have their ideas. And he notes that this sort of way of directing, facilitation, is more characteristic of applied theatre contexts. So where work is being made in schools, in prisons, in the community, more broadly speaking. But he says, this is a quote from Shepard, when directing modulates via its interest in facilitation into leading, as in leading the workshops, leading the process, the importance of the finished artwork diminishes. And I'd like to put this out there as a question. Would you agree with that or not? I mean, do we think that facilitation is of a lesser aesthetic value? I don't know. We might come back to that. So in thinking about this particular case study and this particular notion I want to propose, the notion of hierarchical directing, I think it's very important to question some of the unquestioned premises of both Shepard's scholarship and scholarship more broadly in our field. And some of these premises include the notion that manifest authorship of a mise en scène has greater value than latent authorship of a working structure. Another premise in Shepard is that aesthetic value of an artwork is necessarily commensurate with assertion of individual authority. And here I think it is important to consider authority in both senses of the word. So authority as something pertaining to authorship on the one hand, and authority as something that we associate more commonly with repressive holding of power. So we think of authorities as, you know, police and the army and so on. But actually authority, you know, is something that we should be also thinking about in relation to authorship. And then we have this tendency also to ascribe authority to one particular single figure as opposed to, you know, how it is shared collectively. And then another thing that bothers me slightly as an unquestioned premise is this notion that the director's denunciation of sole authorship in favor of collaboration is very often dismissed a priori by scholars as false modesty. So when Robert Lepage or Simon McBurney say, I'm not interested in being the authority, I take my ideas from my ensemble, very often we say, oh no, that he's just being modest. He's just, you know, not being honest. And it may be that he's just being modest or not being honest, but I'm also interested in what about if they are trying to be honest? So why are we rejecting this possibility that the leader of an ensemble is not interested in being seen as the authority? I think this is bound together with this romantic notion of the author and authorship more broadly. And I write about that in my latest book, if anyone is interested. But yeah, this is one of the unquestioned premises that I was sort of trying to address in this particular case study. Another little kind of detour into another sphere of influence here in thinking about this example is this relationship between directors' theatre on the one hand and performance or live art practices on the other. And we have a very interesting paper from Alex Mermakidis where she writes specifically about Forced Entertainment, the company, the British company Forced Entertainment, and its leader Tim Etchells. And she tries to place Forced Entertainment within these two lineages, or rather in between these two lineages of director's theatre on one hand, which is characterized by calculated intentionality, individual authorship, artistic virtuosity, imposition of the directorial vision, and performance and live art practices on the other hand, which is characterized by a rejection of hierarchy, adoption of a system of compositional rules, and facilitation of a devolved model of authorship. And she decides that Forced Entertainment and Tim Etchells kind of fall in between the two of these. And she says Forced Entertainment operates a hybrid model of theatre making, a pairing of anti-hierarchical group creation with the precision and rigor of an individual vision. And I thought that was an interesting sort of point of reference in thinking about this. But also another thing that was of interest to me in thinking about this particular case was this emergence of new research led also by Alex Mermakidis and another colleague of hers, Jackie Smart, in their book Devising in Process, where they identify a model of artistic leadership consisting of a core of two people. And they say that this model is favored by 50% of the companies that they studied in their book Devising in Process, which came out in the year 2010. And they say the desire on the one hand for group structures that enable collaboration and to some degree resist sole directorial authority, and on the other, the economic difficulty of continuously sustaining a large group of people is the reason for kind of this emergence of a new form of leadership. You know, companies like Punch Drunk, I mentioned earlier, that is led by two people rather than one. And similarly, in my own book, The Contemporary Ensemble, I encountered quite a few people who talked to me about either having ensembles that don't have a director, such as the Riot Group, or having ensembles such as the Chicago-based neo-futurists that kind of operate some sense of devolved leadership, having, like, you know, appointed leaders who sort of spread the model of working in different places, or reluctant ensemble leaders, people like Fairley McDermott of Improbable or Antoinette Dasinski of Derivative Theatre, both of whom in the interview they gave me told me that they don't like being a director, but that they've fallen into the role of being a director, having been an actor previously, because that role was needed. And here I come at this notion, I come back to this notion of heterarchy, which I'm going to try and define now with a reference to some of the other fields of knowledge. The notion occurs in fields such as neurophysiology and cybernetics. These are kind of some names of authors and the years of publication when they use the term in their research. It appears in the research around governance and international relations, but also in archaeology and anthropology, and this is the text I read in researching for this particular paper. And Carol Crumley defines heterarchy as the relation of elements to one another when they are unranked or when they possess the potential of being ranked in a number of different ways. It is, she says, a system by which power is dispersed. It is shared or counterpoised rather than permanently ranked relative to one another. And she says it is particularly observable within the study of self-organizing systems, from snowflakes to human beings, and as such it has set the stage for renewed collaboration among physical, biological, and social scientists. In my more recent research, the one about the dramaturgies of speech and sound, I've been interviewing more artists and ensembles about how they work. And actually, very often I've come across this method of working where, you know, we have an ensemble of people working together, and they don't have a director, but they rotate the role of a directorial figure or the outside eye or whatever you want to call it amongst the ensemble members. So people just take this role on and pass it on. So we don't have a permanent leader, a permanent director, but the role is held and passed on to members of the ensemble sort of equally. And that's maybe what Carol Crumley means by a system by which power is dispersed or shared or counterpoised.
Sorry, does that happen for one performance or during the work on a single performance?
During the work.
On a single performance?
Yes, but it's a method of working that, yes. So you know, specifically I'm thinking of one ensemble of dancers that I interviewed who don't have a director, but they're an ensemble of 4. They are aware of the fact that it's necessary for someone to come out and look at the work from the outside and feed in feedback in order to develop it further. But that role rotates, yeah? So, okay. And Bruno Latour, as I mentioned at the beginning, also uses the term heterarchy to refer to this work by Saraceno. And he is particularly interested in Saraceno's artwork as a metaphor for a social system based on the idea of a network and a sphere, and a network of spheres. He proposes that this registers the originality of globalization, this particular structure. So what does this mean in relation to directing, and what is a hierarchical director, therefore, in this context? So I was interested in this term because it is potentially useful to describe a director who is personally not interested in hierarchy or the sort of this conventional command-control form of leadership, but has to take that role on. And specifically in relation to improbable, which I will delve into a bit more, it manifests in a particular way. So just for context, this is Lee Simpson in a red jumper and Fairley McDermott in a yellow jumper, a shot from one of their works. They met in the 1980s and they were united by a shared interest in the work of Keith Johnston, who wrote the book Impro, and an interest in improvisation. Lee Simpson is primarily a comedian. He trained as an actor, but before forming Improbable, he was working as a comedian in sort of comedy store, you know, comedy venues in London. Fairley McDermott did a drama and dance degree at the University of Middlesex and was working as an actor before meeting Lee. And in 1996, Lee and Fairley formed a company together with the designer Julian Crouch and producer Nick Sweeting, and they named this company Improbable to underline this significance of improvisation in their work. And these are some of their work. The most famous of their work is probably, or the one that really catapulted them to international fame, is Shock-Headed Peter, which they made in 2000 and they took to West End and Broadway. Since that point on, some of them have worked independently, but they have nonetheless kept the company going, and they keep returning to Improbable as a company and continuing to work together. Fairley, for example, has directed Satyagraha as well, which is another very important work that kind of has international recognition. And another thing that's important to note about Improbable and their work is this annual event that they run called Devoted and Disgruntled. So the Devoted and Disgruntled is a conference that takes place every year from the year 2002 to the present. Usually this conference lasts for several days. And in this conference, they use Harrison Owen's open space conferencing format. And what this means is that the participants set the agenda for the conference. So there is no agenda before the participants meet. The participants put together the agenda, and the conference is run in this self-organizing way. So the conversations around specific topics emerge, and they last as long as needed until they finish, and the conversation moves on to another topic. And this Devoted and Disgruntled event has been really very, very significant in the British ecology, because a lot of really interesting ideas and initiatives and companies have emerged out of this particular annual event. So it's a form of activism that they do as a company. So as I mentioned at the beginning, they made this piece was commissioned by the National Theatre. This wasn't the first work that Improbable made at the National, but it was the first time that live improvisation was going to take place on the stage of the National Theatre. An interesting thing to note is that this work was being created every night from nothing, ex nihilo, so to speak, to such an extent that they did not even have a set that they brought on. So what they did was they actually just performed their improvisation every night on the set of another show that they were sharing the stage with. And you know, maybe there were some props that were added to this, but there was absolutely no pre-existing materiality to this particular process, other than this found set, if you like, and the title of the piece, which was Lost Without Words. So they are interested by Keith Johnston. I don't know to what extent people are familiar with Keith Johnston's work, but he's begun his work in the 1960s at the Royal Court. He had a kind of role of a dramaturg at the time, but what was specific about his way of working was that he was not interested in working with text or working with he was working with writers, but the writers were brought into the workshops to workshop ideas and enact them, not to read the text, not to do staged readings or to just kind of workshop the pre-existing texts, but to test out ideas. And as I say in my abstract for this talk, one of the really important aspects of the British context is that they had the institution of the censor until 1968. And the way that the censorship worked was that in order for anything to be performed on the British stage before 1968, the text had to be run past the censor. So that meant there was no improvisation. Improvisation was not possible before 1968, because everything had to be presented in the format of a script to the censor before it was performed. And so 1968 is for that reason an important date in British theatre, because it then gives rise to devising, as we know, as Catherine will maybe touch on, 1968 being this important date. Because it's also for the British practitioners a moment of liberation from the script in this very institutionalized way. Nonetheless, Keith Johnson did manage to get one improvised show on stage in 1965, and this was a children's improvised show called Clowning, which was approved by the Lord Chamberlain because it was described as a lecture with an introduction, with audience participation and status exercises for clowns. So he then went on to found a company called the Theatre Machine, which was an improv troupe, pioneering its own brand of spontaneous creation in front of an audience, with Johnson coaching from the sides. So this is not a kind of improvisation that has pre-existing roles or scenarios in the Commedia dell'arte vein. It is all being created there and then. And Teresa Robbins Dudek, who is a biographer of Keith Johnson, writes in her book about him that when he then moved on to Canada later on in life and began to teach, she found that his courses or course documents kind of had documented an interest in status, spontaneity, silencing the verbal mind, as well as Stanislavski Vakhtangov, Taoism, and Zen. So these are some of the rehearsal principles that Improbable had in their process. So one is Johnson's improv, which is a key but not the only influence in the way they work. The other is the importance of ensemble. They're really dedicated to this ensemble way of working. And Lee Simpson has described their process by saying, when one works on the company, the piece takes care of itself. Another one is this Harrison Owens open space technology that I mentioned earlier, this open space conferencing principle. And from this, they draw this ritual of the check-in and check-out circles. So every day begins with a check-in, with people sitting in a circle, and checking in, just sharing whatever is on their mind at that moment in time. And it ends with a check-out, sitting in a circle and just sharing whatever is on their mind at that moment in time. They are dedicated to the notion of experiment and research in the course of rehearsal, and that inevitably entails failure. So it's about accepting failure as part of the process. They also work with Michael Chekhov's atmospheres and with Jungian kind of practice that was developed by Arne Mindell called process work, which places an emphasis on sort of the exploration of roles that are present in the room, as well as with an attention to the working of the subconscious as a source of creativity. So, for example, in that check-in circle or check-out circle, check-in circle, usually people would be invited to share their dreams, to try and see what is present subconsciously in the room. So this is a check-in circle, for example, and yes, these are maybe some principles of the hierarchical director. Maybe to finish on this slide, the hierarchical director renounces sole authority in favor of nurturing multiple authorities within the rehearsal room. The hierarchical director is interested in systemic rather than individual leadership. As such, he or she cultivates self-sustaining processes of communication and creation in the rehearsal room, and is interested to discover outcomes of those processes rather than predict or influence them. And the hierarchical director does not feel artistically or authorially diminished by pedagogy, coaching, facilitation, or enabling. They are not afraid of failure, and they function as only one sphere of a network of multiple spheres of influence within the artwork they are creating.